didn't sit there. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's great to have you here again. So now we'll start with something else than Botond. It's my great pleasure to talk about first two awards for two best papers of senior by impact, by junior by age from their PhD graduation. So there is this award has been started by Guido Tabellini a few years ago, and it is awarded for two best papers to economists that are participating here and graduated at most a year before the conference. So, well, if not there, you'll see it here. Something's happening. Okay, so our first awardee is Guoyan. She's a professor at University of Melbourne, and it's for this fantastic paper. It's in the field of econometrics. So you can come up. Can you maybe take a picture then of the two of them? So, in the introduction, I will be saying how useful Botond is. With you? Well, the two of you would be great. And then, well, wait a second. The second awardee is Giacomo Lanzani, now at Harvard, soon to join the University of Berkeley. And this is a prize for economic theory. Congratulations. Thanks a lot. You will also get and then, guys, if you go, I'll take a picture of you and Botond. So this picture is going to go somewhere. Oh, maybe this one. This one. Yes. Very good. Wonderful. And I'll take one more with all of you. This will be... Thank you again. Congratulations for the amazing paper. And now we'll get to Botond. So again, it's my great pleasure to introduce him very briefly because nothing would be long enough anyway. And you saw already that Botond is a super humble guy, and I didn't worry about using him in ways that would somehow, would not justify his stature. But anyway, so he used to be a professor at Berkeley. Then he moved home to help his country, to Budapest, to CEU, and then he was driven away by politicians there. He's a professor at the University of Bonn now. He's a world-leading behavioral economist. In most of his work, he always takes something psychologically very realistic, well micro-founded, and then he studies implications of that. And he did groundbreaking work on a lot of important topics, including addiction, consumer choice, consumer naivete, a lot of other stuff that can be life-changing. Studied anxiety, happiness, has received a lot of awards, has done a lot of work for the profession, including editorial work, of course published in all the leading journals, but his work is great, widely read, has a lot of impact. The awards, let me just mention the award for the best European economist under the age of 45 by European Economic Association, Yrjö Jansson Award. And to today he's going to talk about social responsibility. Thanks a lot for coming, Botond. I'll take my stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. That was extremely kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to talk about a paper that's joined with Mark Kaufman and Malte Korneman. It's the second paper in a more general agenda we have that's also joined with Peter Andre, where we try to understand essentially like general average consumer markets, competitive consumer markets under a combination of two assumptions. The first one is that market, trade, consumption, whatever, production causes externalities. So this is a familiar issue to economists. I don't need to say anything more, except that usually implications of this assumption are studied by economists under the additional assumption that consumers don't care about the externalities they cause. But the second assumption we want to consider is that at least some consumers do care, in the sense that they're willing to reduce their consumption or modify their consumption to mitigate associated CO2 emissions, human suffering, animal suffering, or whatever. So let's call these consumers socially responsible. That's the kind of socially responsible consumers we are interested in studying the implications of in like a market equilibrium. So we want to develop a framework for this and also investigate implications. And our kind of rough overarching research strategy is that we start with developing a framework for rational consequentialist consumers, so rational consequentialist socially responsible consumers. This, we think, corresponds most closely to traditions of economic theory, like general equilibrium analysis, etc. It's also the most complex one in this setting. So we are going to do that first and then add alternative types of consumers to this setting. Okay? So kind of a first pass approach, let's say, you could take to think about socially responsible consumers is to go to a supply-demand diagram or an analytical framework related analytical framework, and then just say, well, let's start with like supply and demand in a situation with socially non-responsible consumers or a product that's not polluting. And then what if there is a product that's polluting and consumers are socially responsible? Well, if consumers care about the externalities they cause, then that reduces their demand for externality generating products, so it basically shifts their demand curve down. And then so we get kind of an inward green shift in the demand curve, and we get a greener equilibrium. But other than that, we don't really need to modify the analytical framework. We can use the same diagram or similar framework we would otherwise use to study things. So this project and today's talk is about things that this is kind of fundamentally incorrect way of thinking about it. And the reason it's incorrect is that you cannot really draw a demand curve in the traditional way, because with rational, consequentialist, responsible consumers, the demand curve is endogenous to the equilibrium, so it does not exist separately from the equilibrium, so you have to think about it more carefully. And if if the supply curve comes from consumers too, which is what we're going to have today, then that's endogenous to the equilibrium too. Okay, so so with that quick introduction, what are we going to talk about today? So it's going to be about secondary markets, or markets for used products. So let me just say, put a couple of numbers up there. These are big. For many consumer goods, they're secondary, so these are durable goods. Their secondary markets are big. And it's also touted as increasingly important nowadays for sustainability, so that, because there are negative externalities from primary production, and to avoid that, we should rely on used products and used markets more and more. So there's this estimate by McKinsey that the EU market for recycled, refurbished, and used stuff is going to grow by 2030 to about 22 to 38% of the total consumer goods market. Okay, so these are big, and they're supposed to help with sustainability. Now, the reason we wanted to think about this is that there is an intuition out there, we think, that suggests that secondary markets help with sustainability efforts, in part by engaging socially responsible consumers, in the sense that they induce socially responsible consumers to purchase used stuff, purchase on the secondary market, stuff that other consumers don't want, right? And indeed, there are tons of surveys of consumers and why they purchase on the secondary market, and one main reason expressed for why they purchase there is sustainability. Okay, another one is lower prices, but sustainability is one main reason. But despite this, the interaction between social responsibility and secondary markets is not formally explored in the theoretical literature. So that's what we want to do here. Okay, so we are going to investigate the effects of secondary markets when social responsibility drives secondary market trade. So rather than the usual classical reasons for secondary market trade, we are going to ask, what if it's social responsibility, like expressed in these surveys or based on intuitions? What if it's social responsibility that drives this trade? What are the effects of secondary markets? By the way, feel free to ask during the talk if you have questions. Okay, so what we find basically is because of socially responsible consumers, secondary markets are, depending on interpretation, often or typically harmful. So they lower welfare relative to a situation where there is no secondary market. So basically, secondary markets are often bad. And the reason is that they introduce three harmful forces that undermine, and I'll show you one example in which they can even reverse social responsibility. Okay, the first force is that, in the secondary markets make available a product, used products, which are sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly, depending on exactly the settings, but these used goods are perceived as less harmful than buying new goods. And because of that, responsible consumers feel liberated to consume more. So it's responsible consumers, because of secondary markets, consume more. Okay? Now, this demand for used products by responsible consumers pushes up the price of used products. So that's the resale price of future resale price of new products. So then selfish consumers who are buying new stuff, selfish or less responsible consumers who are buying new stuff, anticipating a higher resale price, they also buy more. Okay, so everybody buys more. And somebody has to supply these things, so production must increase often. Okay, and the third, somewhat more subtle effect is that socially responsible consumers who sell on the secondary market, they may correctly understand that by supplying the secondary market, they reduce new purchases by others. And because they are socially responsible, that again induces them to buy more. So that's another reason they buy more. So these are the three harmful forces that often make secondary markets bad. There is a beneficial force acting in the other direction, which is that responsible consumers are willing to consume goods that would otherwise be thrown away. Okay, in some situations they're willing to do this. So this is, it could in general go either way, but it often goes in the bad way. In particular, if used goods are always useful, so they never have negative utility, so they always have positive marginal utility, then secondary markets are always harmful. And if used goods could have, you see what this means exactly, if used goods could have substantially negative utility, then in those situations, secondary markets can be beneficial, but it's not robust. It could go either way. Okay, any questions? Yeah? The third one, yeah. So you know, I'm buying baby clothes, and I know that I'm on only new ones, and I'm only going to use it for 6 months, and I'm socially responsible. Or 2 months, the baby is going to grow out of it, and I feel bad because then I have to, then I have to throw it away, right? So I'm buying this new stuff. Now, suppose I can supply it to the secondary market, then I understand that if I sell it on the secondary market, other people will use it, and therefore they will not buy new. Okay? That makes me feel good, so it's more okay to buy a lot of baby clothes. So that's the basic idea. Okay, so in terms of literature, so basically we are studying durable goods and secondary markets and socially responsible consumers. As far as we know, we are the first to combine this in this precise theoretical framework, and also to study social responsibility in a dynamic context like this. But there is a large literature on socially responsible consumers, and especially investors that are related but not really close to the paper. Then I mentioned this is the second paper in a kind of general agenda. We are building on a framework we developed before for static settings. We are basically extending that to dynamic settings. Okay, yeah, you can ask if you have other questions about this related stuff, but otherwise I'll just move on to the model. Okay, so so as I mentioned, we are going to start with rational consequentialist consumers. So how do we think about markets with them around? So let's just look at the basics. So we are going to think about a setting where there are a finite number of consumers, but many of them. So formally, we think of our framework as exactly applying when the number of consumers approaches infinity. Okay, infinitely many periods, and then new goods are in perfectly elastic supply at price P, and buying a new good, let's just assume, generates, so raises production and generates a production externality. Okay, that's the bad stuff that's happening here. And then used goods, yeah, so there's a used goods market every period 2. They are available at a market determined price that's determined on this used goods market, and there is also free disposal of used goods, so the used goods price PU must always be non-negative. Okay, and then if you, let's say you consume an amount Cn of new goods in a period and an amount Cu of used goods, then you start next period with an amount 1 minus f Cn plus Cu of used goods, where f is a fragility, some number between 0 and 1. So basically, between periods, some fraction f of goods disappears, so breaks, and new goods become used goods. Okay, so that's the basic like physical environment or whatever. Okay, now just so to set up later the equilibrium and so on, let's just think for a second intuitively, how does a small consumer affect production in this setting? So, like I'm a consequentialist consumer, I want to think about, well, if I buy stuff, how does that affect things? What do I need to think about? So let's think of, if I enter the market, buy some stuff that shifts the demand curve in the market. There are many consumers, so it's a tiny shift in the demand curve. How does that, tiny relative shift, so how does that affect production, which is what's causing the externality here? Well, first of all, by assumption, if I buy new, then I raise current production 1-to-1. Okay, so that's the simple one. If I buy a used product, then in general, I'm going to raise the used price PU in the market, and that's going to lead others to find used stuff all of a sudden too expensive, so they shift to buying new, and they are the ones who raise current production. So that's a standard kind of price effect. So this is where, in the previous paper, we showed that the price effect here, that I raise the price PU, that's for a small consumer, that's negligible, but the production effect is not. So as a rational consequentialist consumer, I will ignore the price effect, so I will think of the price as basically fixed, but I will not think of production as fixed. So that's a kind of violation of price taking. We showed this in the previous paper, that's also true here. Okay, so this is a direct effect, this is an indirect effect I have, and another indirect effect I have is that if I raise current production, then I also raise future used supply, and that lowers the future used price, and that leads others to buy less new stuff, etc. Okay, and again, this is not negligible. This effect is not negligible. So I should care about this. Yep.
So here you're assuming that supply is perfectly elastic.
Yeah.
So here you're assuming that, no, that's my thought, yeah. The prices are perfectly elastic, and so that kind of makes some of that second effect kind of more muted, I'm guessing. But in the other paper, do you also assume that, or they're assuming?
Oh no, so in the other paper, we didn't assume that supply is perfectly elastic. Yeah, and in fact, there, so basically this perfectly elastic supply rules out the main effect that we analyzed in the other paper. And we do this, we do that, well, partly to be clear about that it's now the new dynamic effects are coming into play, but also this makes it easier to analyze this dynamic model.
And the conclusions survive if I were making the prices, the supply not perfectly elastic?
Well, we don't quite know how to analyze, but so that's we don't see any reason why they wouldn't survive. They don't depend on this perfectly elastic supply. It just makes it more easier to analyze. But I mean, in general, since we didn't fully prove it, we don't know. In the other paper, if you make supply non-perfectly elastic, then you have another effect that's also problematic. So then even for new products, we have an additional. Then we would have an additional problematic effect, and that's exactly what we wanted to rule out with the perfectly elastic supply. We can talk more about that. I don't want to get into what happens there. Yeah. Okay. So now let's try to put this together into kind of an equilibrium framework. So we are going to look at, and the reason I'm doing it in this order is that, as I mentioned, you cannot define preferences independently of the equilibrium. So it's kind of not obvious in exactly how to set up the equilibrium, but this is one coherent way of doing it. So we are going to look at steady state competitive equilibria where there is a constant price PU star and constant consumption, and then you either have a zero price and excess supply or market clearing. So that's the standard part. And then we are going to assume that if a consumer sees an arbitrarily small surprise deviation from PU star, so you know the equilibrium is supposed to be PU star, PU star, PU star, but all of a sudden there is a small deviation. Consumer sees that, she's still going to expect the same to future prices to be PU star. So she expects prices to return to the equilibrium price, and she expects to have the same impact on production. So this is one way of dealing with this, so we can talk about this too. We didn't think that much about alternatives, but so there seems to be a very good rationale for this, which is that in reality there is some noise in price determination, and that would make small deviations from equilibrium undetectable to small consumers. So they would not notice that the prices are not equilibrium prices. So that we incorporate that directly into the definition, although we don't model the noise, etc. Okay. So now with that in mind, if we have a consumer who is facing a current used price of PU, she's going to maximize the following. So, so first, the consumption utility from consumption. So new products, used products, and so this means that used products are substitutes to new products, except that used products have a marginal utility that's L lower. Okay, and then you have to pay for the products. And then tomorrow, this is the amount of products you have left over. And the value of those on the used market is PU star times that. You expect a used price of PU star in the future, so this is how much you expect your used products tomorrow to be worth. So this is so far standard net consumption utility, private net consumption utility. And then the crucial part is this last part, which is the consumer social concerns. So we assume that a consumer derives this utility in proportion K to her impact on production, where K is distributed according to some distribution in the population. And these Rn star and Ru star are the production impacts of new and used purchases per unit. So this is the preference of a socially responsible consumer, consequentialist. And then finally, to close things down, note here that we assume that all consumers have the same private consumption utility. We do that to isolate, so if they had different consumption utility, for example, some people were light used stuff or didn't want to pay for new stuff or something like that, that would create trade on the secondary market for purely classical standard reasons. We want to think about just the implications of externalities and social responsibility, so that's why we assume everybody has the same private consumption utility. But okay, so now we want to kind of close the model in a coherent way, and to do that we introduce a consistency requirement on these production impacts of new and used purchases. Okay, so here's how to think about that. So given any impact, so from the consumer's perspective, she's thinking about what impact she has. From her perspective, the impact is just exogenously given. Okay, so from the perspective of each individual tiny consumer. Okay, so those are exogenously given. So she takes those as given, and then she calculates her demand by maximizing this utility function. Now that generates a demand curve, given the distribution of social responsibility or social coefficients, K. That generates a demand curve, and then how does a consumer's impact come about? As you know, I tried to give an intuition for in the previous slide. A consumer's effect comes from the fact that her purchases shift the demand curve a little bit. So then you have to take these demand curves, and if you shift them a little bit and trace out the production impact of these slight shifts in the demand curve, you have to get back these impacts, Rn star and Ru star. Otherwise, the framework is not coherent, or expectations are not rational, or whatever. Okay, so this is what it takes to introduce social, rational, consequentially socially responsible consumers into this kind of framework. Okay. Okay, so now I have until 12:30. Philip, 12:30? Yes. Okay. Okay, so
5 minutes extra.
okay. Okay, so yeah. So in order to, okay, so now to evaluate social welfare, we are just going to assume that production has some social cost, capital K. Yep, and we assume that little k, so this a consumer social coefficient is less than capital K, which just means that consumers don't fully internalize the externality they're causing, or the social cost of the externality they're causing. And we also assume that L, this utility from used products, is less than P plus K, which means intuitively that discarding used stuff and buying new stuff instead is inefficient. So from a social perspective, you should never discard used stuff. So this means that if somebody does discard used stuff, you can think of that as premature waste. And just conceptually, or to interpret our results, it seems useful to distinguish that from what you might call unavoidable waste, which is stuff that's thrown away because it has no use even from a social perspective anymore. Okay? Here we assume that any waste is premature waste. You can think of the stuff in our model that breaks as unavoidable waste. We don't explicitly introduce it that way. But so one reason it's difficult to kind of map our model straight to reality is that we don't know whether what the waste we see, how much of that is premature waste and how much of that is unavoidable waste, because we don't know the social value of stuff that's being thrown away. So the fact that there is waste is consistent with all versions of our model. Okay. So just for this talk, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples that greatly simplifies this full equilibrium framework and makes it much more intuitive. Look at two interesting cases of L, and for the examples that we do throughout the paper, but for the examples in the talk, I'm going to just assume that some share of consumers are selfish and some share of consumers are socially responsible with the same K. So they binary distribution. Okay. Okay, so here is our best case. I start with the best case for the secondary market. So let's assume that L is between P and P plus kappa, where kappa is the socially responsible consumers coefficient. So the fact that L is greater than P means that from a private perspective, since the disutility from used stuff is greater than the new price from a private perspective, you prefer to dump used stuff and just buy new instead. So this, let's say, potentially this applies to fast fashion. You buy it, looks nice. 6 months later, it doesn't look so nice. From a private perspective, you prefer to put it in the garbage to using it and buy new stuff instead. Okay. So let's think about the benchmark. What if there is no secondary market? Then, since L is greater than P again, the selfish consumers just dump their used goods every period and buy new stuff every period. Okay, but L is less than P plus kappa, so responsible consumers, when they factor in the new price and also the externality they're causing by buying new, that's too much. They would rather keep their used goods, so they buy new goods only to replenish their stock. Okay, so what happens when there is a secondary market? Then we could have an equilibrium where the used price is 0. The effect of a new purchase is 1, the production effect, and the effect of a used purchase is 0. Okay, so this, and in this equilibrium, the selfish consumers buy new, and then to the extent they can, they sell their used things, and what they can't sell, they discard. And the responsible consumers buy used stuff. Now, it's easy to check, given this point 1, that consumer behavior is consistent with equilibrium, this proposed equilibrium. So let's just check consistency of R n star and RU star of these effects. So whether they actually arise in equilibrium, and they do. In this case, it's easy to check. If I buy a used product, then stuff is being discarded. So I don't affect current production by buying used stuff. I reduce waste. The selfish people are selling all the used they can and they discard the rest. That way they will sell more, discard less. I don't affect new production. So then indeed, our U star is 0. The effect of a used purchase on production is 0. If I buy a new thing, by assumption I raise current production. So I affect current production 1 to 1. But after that, I don't affect production anymore because I raise, by raising current production, I raise future used supply. But that just means more stuff is going to be discarded tomorrow. So then our N star is 1. So we have checked. This is this equilibrium is this is consistent. So we have an equilibrium. Furthermore, in this equilibrium, selfish consumers consume the same amount as without the secondary market, because basically, with or without the secondary market, they buy their new stuff, wear it, and are left over with some used stuff. With or without the secondary market, it's useless to them. They don't like it, and it has no value. So they basically face the same problem as before, so they consume the same amount. So then, with responsible not buying new stuff with the secondary market reduces production and is beneficial. So, so this is the situation I talked about, the positive force, that the responsible consumers are willing to sacrifice their private utility to lower new production and reduce waste, etc. And the secondary market facilitates this private sacrifice, so it's beneficial. So we are calling it a market. It's not really a market because the price is 0 and there is no market clearing. So it's more like donation than market, but yeah, in any case, having this exchange of used products is beneficial. So maybe a potential example of that is as you can notice, I'm using clothes repeatedly as examples. So maybe a potential example is apparel donations to thrift stores, where there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's tons of stuff donated to thrift stores. Very little is sold in these stores. A lot of it is shipped to developing countries, where a little more is sold, but still not very much, and then a bunch of it is just dumped and it becomes waste in developing countries. So that could reflect this mix of donations and waste that's in this equilibrium, maybe. Okay, so this is one possibility. Any questions? Okay, so now let's make a single change. Let's assume that L is equal to 0, so that used goods don't generate this utility, so they are perfect substitutes to new goods. So in that case, consumption utility depends on Cn, just the sum of the two, so Cn plus Cu, and equals U of that, U of Cn plus Cu. Okay, so now we have a situation where, from a private perspective, you prefer keeping used stuff to dumping it, even without a secondary market, without a secondary market. And arguably, this applies to like brand name clothing or quality electronics and stuff like this. These are exactly the markets whose resale the products whose resale markets have grown tremendously over the last few years. Okay, so for example, if you have a high quality brand clothing, even if you're rarely wearing it, you still keep it in your closet. Maybe it will be useful. That's the kind of stuff we are talking about here. So let's look at benchmarks again. So without a secondary market, the only way you can increase your consumption on the margin is to buy new stuff, right? So then the kind of, let's say you buy one more item today, then you have to pay P for it, and you generate an externality, so kind of the total cost the consumer thinks about is P plus K. But tomorrow she has 1 minus F items left over, so she can buy 1 minus F fewer items tomorrow. So kind of the net cost in this sense of increasing consumption today by a unit is F times P plus K for each of the selfish consumer and the responsible consumer. So that's one benchmark. Another benchmark you could have is when there are secondary markets, but there are only selfish consumers out there, then the selfish consumers don't care whether a product is new or used, so PU star is equal to P, and therefore everything is as without the secondary market. So with selfish consumers, the secondary market makes no difference. Okay, so now with a secondary market, I rewrote the first order conditions for consumption without the secondary market here. So what happens with the secondary market? Now, there may be an equilibrium in which PU star is kind of high between P and P plus kappa. And again, new purchases have an externality effect and used purchases do not. Selfish consumers strictly prefer new goods, so every period they sell their used goods to responsible consumers, and responsible consumers strictly prefer used goods. So again, consumer behavior is consistent. It's easy to check that it's consistent with 1. So let's check consistency. Are the effects of the purchases really as postulated? So if I buy a used product here in this equilibrium, I raise the used price PU, and that leads others to buy less used stuff, but it has no effect on production because consumers have strict preferences, so nobody switches over to the new market. Okay, so indeed, if I buy used stuff, then my effect is 0. If I buy new stuff, then I raise current production as before, and again, I also raise future used supply and lower the future used price PU, but this doesn't affect production again because of the strict preferences. Okay, now, okay, so this is an equilibrium. So how much is being consumed in this equilibrium? Selfish consumers set marginal utility equal to P minus 1 minus FPU star because in order to buy a unit, they have to pay P, but then they can sell it for PU star tomorrow. So this is the kind of net price of consumption. And responsible consumers, they are buying used stuff, so they don't have an effect on production, so they also don't think about the externality, so they have to pay PU star for a unit of consumption, and they can sell it tomorrow for PU star, so their net price is FPU star. Okay? Now, the thing to notice here is that this value here is less than FP, and this value here is less than FP plus kappa. So both types consume more than without the secondary market. And since production is in steady state has to equal the fragility times consumption, the fact that both of them consume more means that production is higher with the secondary market than without. Okay, so in this situation, the secondary market is harmful. So let's think about this. Let's think about this a bit more. So the logic is is kind of two of the forces that I talked about are present here. So these are rational consumers. The socially responsible consumers are realizing that if I buy used, I'm not generating an externality. So I can buy more than if the secondary market didn't exist. So they choose to buy only used stuff, but they're liberated by the knowledge that they're not causing an externality to consume more. So they're consuming more. And the demand for used stuff raises the used price. So that means that the selfish are also consuming more. And all consumption ultimately comes from new production. So in order for everyone to consume more, production has to be higher. Okay, so production is higher than without the secondary market. And remember the benchmark that when there were only selfish consumers in the population, then the secondary market made no difference. Now with socially responsible consumers, the secondary market is harmful. So the secondary market is harmful because of socially responsible consumers. It's because the socially responsible consumers make it harmful, their presence. Or, yeah, depending on the interpretation or the interaction of the socially responsible and selfish consumers. So this is a new explanation for why sellers may like secondary markets. There are other explanations out there, but it's kind of a question mark in general whether sellers, producers of new stuff, why they would like secondary markets, because it competes directly with their primary markets. So here we have an explanation for why sellers may like secondary markets, a completely different logic from previous ones. It's also consistent with this growing tendency of many primary producers to embrace resale markets that I mentioned. And from the perspective of our model, the promotion of resale markets by producers of new stuff, you can think of that as like the perfect greenwashing strategy, because in equilibrium, used stuff does produce lower externalities than new stuff. So somebody who sells used stuff can be quite logically seen as somebody who is promoting sustainability and so on. But in reality, having the resale market around is actually good for production. It raises production, and it's bad for social welfare, environment, or whatever. Okay. And then let me make one more comment. So why is the secondary market harmful? It's harmful because it encourages consumption, right? It raises consumption by everybody. So that generates externalities. So you'd think, okay, if it's harmful by encouraging consumption, at least private consumption utility will go up due to the secondary markets, right? Because everybody is consuming more. And that's not true either. It could be the case that the secondary market both causes harm through generating more externalities, and it also lowers the population's average or total private net consumption utility. So in particular, this happens if the used price is kind of is high, and I'll just describe what happens then. And it's basically with the secondary market, responsible consumers consume the same amount as without, but they are paying a lot for it because the price is high. So they're sacrificing actually a lot of private utility to buy this stuff, which ultimately is not useful. And then selfish consumers are consuming more than without the secondary market, but it's in a range where their they've been consuming a lot already, and their marginal utility is quite low, so it's not worth the production cost. So in this situation, all the secondary market does is to provide a subsidy to selfish consumers that's inefficient even if you ignore externalities. So it's just all around harmful. Okay. Okay, so any questions?
So you said here this is an equilibrium. Do you know if this is the only one?
Yeah, so that's where we in the paper we characterize all of them. So there is always one equilibrium with rational consumers. There is always one equilibrium which is exactly the same as without the secondary market, and then all other equilibria are strictly worse. Everybody consumes strictly more than without the secondary market, and social welfare is strictly lower. So in general, it's weakly bad. So that's the sense.
Second thing is there's like something that's like somehow doesn't show up here. I'm trying to understand where, and I couldn't find it. And that is the things in the secondary market somehow crowding out things in the the use of new goods. Somehow it doesn't show up, and I'm couldn't quite see through the model. Like, why is there no competition by the used products with the primary products, and that for reducing their prices?
Yeah. So that's basically because it competes. So I think this is a classical issue. It's the secondary markets compete with the primary markets, but they also provide a sale opportunity. So if you buy in the primary market, you can sell on the secondary market. And basically, we have set up the model, and this is analogous to some classical contributions. We have set up the model so that if there are only selfish consumers, these two forces exactly cancel. So that's why with only selfish consumers, they're neutral. And then we added responsible consumers to it, yeah. So, and there are some of these neutrality results out there that are much more general than ours, and that's also because these two forces cancel.
So is it true that they will always cancel, or are there like assumptions that would make them not cancel? And then that makes the follow-up question is like, if these forces do not cancel, do they just kind of, is this just like an adding up thing where like that might, you might get some canceling out, but this effect is still there? Is there any interaction between them, or you don't know?
Yeah, so that's where you're again going to in a direction where we don't know.
Okay.
So they don't always cancel. There is a literature on this, and in simple settings they cancel. But if you start adding like informational issues like adverse selection and stuff like that, then they very quickly stop canceling. So whether these things interact with, we don't see a reason why they would act in the opposite direction again, but we don't know for sure. So I think the most interesting interaction to study here would be to add consumers, let's call them low-income and high-income consumers, and low-income consumers already for private reasons prefer used stuff. Whether that would in any way complicate this story, that would be important to check given reasons for buying in the used market, but we are not able to do it yet.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do wonder a bit about how this can generalize to like a dynamic setup. So if I think about my own consumption choices, I have a lifetime budget constraint. If I had perfect foresight on my duration of my life, I would just sort of run down that budget constraint, and the presence of a secondary market doesn't do anything there. And also in reality, you tend to think of production as completely demand determined, but in the end, over the longer run at least, production is very much supply determined. So I do wonder how, if you take a more dynamic perspective, somehow there is the logic seems to be that the existence of a secondary market is able to expand our consumption possibilities, but coming more from a macro perspective, I don't really see how that sort of adds up.
I'm not sure. So what kind of, this is dynamic. It's a dynamic model. So, I mean, we are looking at the steady state, but the dynamic considerations are important here. So I'm not sure what.
But so I have sort of present discounted value of all my future income. And if I had no uncertainty on my lifetime, and if I didn't want to leave a bequest or something, I would just run that down over the course of my life, and that's my lifetime consumption. Now, you seem to suggest that in the world, depending on whether there is a secondary market or not, I would consume more in the secondary market case. But from a macro perspective, I don't really see how that can add up. Where do those goods sort of come from? In reality,
I mean,
production, at least the supply is supply determined. And in your case, that supply is there sort of elastically, but I think that's a very important assumption, because if I try to add this up in a more macro context, I think I would struggle to get the same result, that somehow consumption possibilities over a lifetime can expand by simply adding a secondary market.
well, maybe you and I should talk afterwards, but so in our setting, it's not supply determined. It's determined in equilibrium by supply and demand. And the secondary market raises production because it basically raises demand for stuff. If we assume that, I'm not sure how to think about kind of what you call a supply determined, but consumers here play a crucial role in determining how much is going to be produced, and that's the channel through which it increases production. Yeah. You can explain perhaps afterwards to me exactly. Yeah.
It's that sort of assumption that production is demand determined.
No, it's equilibrium determined. So I
yeah, but
there
does seem to be the notion there that if consumers demand more, then that will also lead to more sort of production. But when you add a production function with capital in there and labor and technology, it's difficult to see where all of that comes from.
No, but okay, it's a standard micro approach in that, things are determined in equilibrium, and demand plays a role in determining how much is produced.
So resources can relocate from other goods, perhaps from goods that don't have the negative
Yeah, or more capital can be put into production or whatever.
Should I? Okay, so one feature of these secondary markets is that usually people do not pay taxes. So do you think that by introducing taxes in this secondary market, you could fix the harmful effects of these markets?
Sorry, say that again, that people don't have...
Usually you don't have to pay taxes in these secondary markets, right?
Okay.
So maybe by introducing these taxes, you could fix the harmful effects because you're reducing the incentives to buy new because you're going to be able to resell it later at a good price, right?
Yeah, I think within our model, that's true. I mean, we only compared no secondary markets versus like completely free secondary markets. We didn't check that comparative static, like if you introduce more and more obstacles or transaction costs or taxes or whatever, we expect it would go more continuously. So yes, it would probably improve things. I wouldn't quite feel comfortable to kind of advocate that just based on this paper because there are effects we are ignoring here. So, but yeah, within this model, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Thanks. In your model, responsible consumers understand the consequences of their behavior, right?
Yeah.
So why do they not just behave like selfish consumers and then kind of get rid of their negative effect on the aggregate? Why can they not just mimic selfish consumers if being social responsibility has actually negative consequences rather than positive ones?
Well, yeah, so it's within the equilibrium that they are stuck with. You know, I'm a small consumer, I can't change the equilibrium. And within the equilibrium they are stuck with, they are doing the best possible thing. So they do better within that equilibrium than if they behaved selfishly. Indeed, because used
collective
products
action
are...
problem.
Sorry?
It's basically a collective action problem then among the socially responsible consumers. They can't coordinate on being selfish.
Yeah, if they could coordinate, they would not do this. If they somehow could coordinate. Yeah, exactly. Now, yeah, so, you know, I just showed you a couple of examples. So the rest of the paper, we are doing kind of expanding all this analysis to various issues. So we first of all identify all equilibria, and we consider general distributions for K, and then we add other types of consumers. So like consumers who don't fully understand or don't necessarily, are not consequentialist necessarily, and see what happens with these variants. So we are asking exactly this, what if consumers have different kinds of considerations there. And what we find basically is that the second example on the harmfulness of secondary markets is very robust, whereas the first one is not robust. So let me just then go to the conclusion. So basically, so I think I hope I got across the idea of how our framework works, and you can easily modify it to add many other types of considerations, like, you know, we didn't talk about recycling or intermediate inputs or endogenizing this fragility, like how durable or fragile the goods are. These are easily incorporated into the framework, and then one can analyze what happens. One thing that's missing from the framework that we think is very interesting in the context of socially responsible consumers is, let's say, signaling consideration, which is, I could be a socially responsible consumer and do stuff not because of its like short-term effect, let's say, on the externality, but to show producers or policymakers to signal to them that there are green consumers out there and that they should change their behavior in response to green consumers. So for example, I could buy expensive green energy just to show that, look, there is demand for this stuff, it's good to invest in this stuff, why don't you invest, or why don't you change your policy toward energy? So that's kind of a signaling consideration, and that requires expanding the framework to incorporate uncertainty and inferences, and that's more of a substantial change. So I'll stop here. Thank you.